Thanks. Well, as you heard, I'll talk for a few minutes about what I think of the transition to the new administration, what we're likely to see, and so on, and then leave it open for questions, and we'll talk about what you'd like to talk about. The first word that came tripping off everyone's lips after the election was historic, and that's correct. It's a historic event to have a black family living in the White House. In fact, an astonishing event. If you go back not too many years, it was inconceivable. So take, say, 40 years ago, or even more recently, it would have been absolutely unimaginable. So that alone qualifies as historic. In fact, it's broader than that. The two Democratic candidates were a black and a woman. And that would have been inconceivable 40 years ago, or even more recently. And what that means is that, yes, historic changes have taken place. The country's gotten a lot more civilized. It is now capable of accepting things that would have been totally unimaginable not long ago. And we know the reasons and should think about them. In fact, they answer the question, what's likely to happen under the Obama administration. The reasons are that in the 1960s, people like you became active, energized, engaged in all sorts of activism, and it set off in motion a wide range of activities, civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement. Most of these things, like, say, the feminist and the environmental movement, didn't even exist in the 60s in anything remotely like their present form. They're part of the aftermath. Later, the international solidarity movements, the huge global justice movement from actually this century and on till today. Now, the effect of all of this was just to change the society. It didn't change the institutions much. They're pretty stable. The institutions of domination and control, decision-making, and so on. But it did change the culture quite a lot and laid the basis for a historical event, an event of historical significance. And the lessons, incidentally, the 60s are constantly defamed in the literature. They're the time of troubles, you know, when kids were all off on dope or Woodstock or doing some breaking windows or something or other. And it's very natural that they should be defamed because they had a strongly democratizing effect. And democracy is hated by elite opinion for very good reasons. Democracy undermines elite control. So it's despised, and we see that all around today in international affairs, everywhere. And the civilizing effect was greatly resisted because people lost privilege and power and domination. And since they're the people who write history, the picture that's presented of these movements is defamatory. But that's natural and normal. You can figure out for yourself what happened and what the reasons are for the change, which is illustrated, one of innumerable illustrations by the last election, many more illustrations. And then the lesson is, well, you know, what happens from now on depends very much on what people like you are going to do. If you become energized, engaged, involved, active, organized, protesting, struggling, and so on, okay, there can be more historical changes. If you choose to resign into apathy and obedience, then you get a reconstruction of what happened before. That's the way history works. We have a legacy of, by comparative and historical standards, of unique privilege and freedom, but it wasn't given as a gift. It was won step by step. It was won by hard struggle. It's never given as a gift. And if population backs off, the gains are taken away. People with power and privilege do not relinquish it easily, and there's no reason to expect them to. Well, the historic event was greeted with quite extraordinary euphoria in the United States, and even more so in Europe. common to read about how it's only in America because something magical like this happened. It's astonishing, et cetera, et cetera. And by European standards, that's true. Europe is probably more racist than the United States, so it's hard to imagine anything like this happening in Europe. But by world standards, it's not true at all. I mean, we tend to disregard, the lesser breeds. Anyone outside the West barely exists. But elsewhere, this would not be a magical moment. In fact, even in comparison with very recent events. So say, take the poorest country of the hemisphere, continental hemisphere, Bolivia. They had an election in 2005. It was reaffirmed with an even stronger vote in a referendum just last year, which is far more democratic than and surprising and amazing than the election of 2008. I mean, in the Bolivian election, unlike here, the population participated. Here, the population listens. There's no popular input into the Obama campaign. In fact, that's the way it's described by its leaders and by the press. There's an army of people who are waiting for instructions from the leader to act to push forward brand Obama. That's the regular characterization. Bolivia was totally different. There were mass popular organizations. The election was just one day in ongoing struggles, hard, difficult struggles. Here, the issues were essentially ignored. You were supposed to think about hope and change and soaring rhetoric and so on, but nobody knows what anyone stands for. And that's not by design. It's not by accident. In Bolivia, the issues were front and center. They were highly significant. Control over resources, cultural rights, social justice, all kinds of things. And they were things that the mass of the population had been struggling for a long time. And they are the most repressed people in the hemisphere. That's the indigenous population. I mean, they don't make much of a difference here because we exterminated them. But in Bolivia, they survived. A little piece of national history for which we don't have museums and so on. But in Bolivia, they survived, the majority. And for the first time in history, they entered the political arena with crucial issues, which included an election, but let us say just one stage. And they elected someone from their own ranks, a poor peasant, to implement the policies that they had designed. Okay? That's democracy. And that's why when you read about Bolivia in the United States, you read that it's undermining democracy. So it's condemned as one of the countries where democracy is being attacked. Yeah, because it's far more democratic than Western societies, and therefore is undermining elite control. And of course, the old elites don't like it. There's a group, mostly white, Europeanized, wealthy, that's run the country forever, and they don't like it. So they're initiating a kind of a secessionist movement with a considerable amount of violence. And predictably, they're being supported by the United States, which is committed and has been for a long time to undermining democracy. Here it's called promoting democracy, but this is the age of Orwell, so it's undermining democracy. And naturally, the U.S. is supporting the secessionist movement of the old westernized elites, which it became pretty violent, the struggle. And Latin America is undergoing important changes. There was a conference of a newly formed organization, the Union of South American Republics, UNASUR, all the countries of South America, including Colombia, the one U.S. ally. They had a meeting in Santiago in which they came out with a resolution condemning the secessionist movement and the violence and strongly supporting